starting with an apology. Those of you who came here expecting me to talk about Dardanelles white, quite simply, I had a terrifically busy summer, including leading two battlefield tours to Gallipoli and one to the Somme, and revising my biography of Haig for publication, which basically meant I didn't make as much progress into Dardanelles white papers as I was hoping. But actually, I made a virtue of a necessity. It's given me the opportunity to sharpen up my ideas, comparing the two theatres, that is Gallipoli and the Western Front. Now, after the erudite paper, which I caught the last few minutes, we now had a bit of a knockabout lecture, for which I don't apologise actually, this is very much a work in progress, and actually I genuinely would welcome your comments on my ideas, which I'm floating. I need to start with a confession, actually. I've actually visited, before this year, I've actually visited Gallipoli 4 times. I've visited Gallipoli at least 3 times before this year. I've been studying it for, horrifyingly, about 35 years. And yet it wasn't until I was there with a military party, actually from 3 UK divisions, some of the brightest and best of the British Army's officers, that the penny dropped about a really significant fact about the campaign. It came when I went up to the observation platform at Akibaba, which wasn't there last time I visited the peninsula. And of course the view was stunning. This is I think actually I stole this off the Gallipoli Association website, but actually see a bit of it. You can see from Morto Bay in the east, south of the Helles Memorial, the Aegean Sea in the west, and looking over your shoulder, as it were, north to ANZAC and Suvla. And it suddenly struck me with a glimpse of a blinding glimpse of the obvious, that the Gallipoli theatre is tiny, and Helles particularly so. Only the fact is that ANZAC is even smaller gives it a spurious impression of size. Now, one can look at a map and note this intellectually, as I had done over the previous 35 years, but only by seeing the ground actually laid out before me did I appreciate it emotionally. And I must say, this actually gave me pause to think, or rethink, my ideas about Gallipoli as an operation. Apart from anything else, the lack of strategic depth was a critical factor in the Gallipoli campaign. For once the amphibious landings had failed to bring about a quick victory, trench warfare, of course, quickly reasserted itself. Now, the argument of this lecture is as follows. The Gallipoli campaign was planned on broadly colonial war assumptions, as in the Turks would not be a first-class enemy, we didn't need to send first-class troops or indeed commanders, and actually it would not be much of an exercise. But once these assumptions proved to be hopelessly awry, trench warfare began in vengeance. But then Gallipoli didn't really replicate trench warfare on the Western Front. It was far worse, with little prospect of improvement. Few, if any, of the conditions which eventually produced mobile warfare in Flanders were, or indeed could be, present at the Dardanelles. I'm afraid probably more blinding glimpses of the obvious, but I think they're points worth making. And so we end up with, to quote this French soldier, so it's siege warfare, or if one prefers trench warfare, exactly as on the French front. I see no end to it. And Professor John Horn has made the very interesting point that the word front in the 20th century has come to symbolise static deadlock. And so, what are we talking about? 3 weeks after the initial landings, already Gallipoli is being referred to as a front, with all that implies. So, and I apologise if people have already spoken to you about this, and you will almost certainly know all this anyway, because I need to rattle through this. Why did the initial landings fail? Well, I've already mentioned the assumption that this was like colonial warfare. And of course the British had a very long tradition of assembling forces to take on colonial enemies, or at least, should we say, second or third class enemies, with whatever troops were available, sending them overseas with whatever commanders were available, and generally muddling through. Not in some cases, though by no means all, involving the extensive logistic, for example, and intelligence preparations that a major campaign would entail. There was also, I think, an absolutely disastrous underestimation of the Ottomans, and I'll come back to this later, but suffice it to say is that the Ottomans belied their indifferent prowess in the Balkan Wars, and indeed in the campaigns in the Caucasus against the Russians. And although I think the German element of this can be overestimated, it should not be underestimated either. There is a sense of common doctrine, and of course many of the Ottoman commanders are actually trained in the German way of doing things. The Hamilton-Kitchener relationship has actually pretty much been done to death, but I think the key point about this is that Hamilton was Kitchener's protege, and he proved notoriously reluctant to stand up to the boss. Critically, of course, at the first meeting, which largely consisted of Kitchener telling Hamilton what he could not have to conduct the operations at the Dardanelles. Again, someone might correct me on this. I think I'm right in saying the only account we have of this meeting is Hamilton's own one, from his Gallipoli diary, which of course is not a contemporary document. It was cobbled together, possibly based on contemporary sources in 1916. But even if Hamilton owns up to this, it might be a bit of sort of, special pleading, but he does not come out very well on that here. Lack of jointery. I apologise for this ghastly military term. I was teaching at the South College again on Monday, and I fell back into bad old ways. Joint warfare, in this case, essentially that means land and naval warfare, a little bit of air thrown in. Amazingly, given the experience of expeditionary warfare, that is warfare conducted when land troops landed from the sea, over the previous 100 years, there was not a properly swept up joint doctrine or joint command system. There was indeed some pamphlets, and in theory there was doctrine. There had been some exercises before the war, but it fell a long way short of the current integrated three-service approach to war. Now what this meant, of course, was actually a huge amount depended on the relationship of the senior soldier and the senior sailor. As it happened, Hamilton and de Robeck actually got on pretty well. There are plenty of examples in British military and naval history where that was not the case, and actually that led pretty disastrously. So basically we lack a sort of doctrinal or organisational underpinning for a joint naval military operation. And finally, of course, I think we have bad luck exacerbated by poor decisions. As Clausewitz nearly said, the toast consistently landed butter side down on the carpet for the Allies in the Gallipoli campaign. But that, of course, was exacerbated by some really severe problems, which I'll talk about some of them later. Something critical to all this is the concept of command culture. Now, culture in this sense, I've defined as the ideas, customs and social behaviour of a discrete group. In this case, we're talking largely about British officers, I suppose basically from the rank of major upwards. Commanders and indeed staffs come into this. And a German historian, Jörg Muth, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, wrote a very interesting book on this a couple of years ago, looking at the American and German approaches, actually in the Second World War, really. But he makes some very key and telling points about how command culture is formed. I mean, basically, the problem is that through selection, training, and promoting of officers, cultures tend to be difficult to change from generation to generation. It takes some really serious leadership being driven from the very top actually to force command cultures to change. I would actually say the British military command culture, certainly that of the army, has actually changed quite radically and for the better in the last 25 years. But if you look back at the sort of the powerful personalities who are involved in this in the late 90s, 80s onwards, you can see how this point is made. Which also, I think, helps to put the British Army's transformation in 4 years, between 14 and 18, into perspective and make it even more remarkable. Anyway, one of the principal problems I think we see at Gallipoli is this, what I've called this form of half-baked mission command. Now, mission command is the modern British US doctrine. Basically, it's the idea that senior commanders set broad objectives, command's intent, and then leave it to subordinates to fill in the gaps. So, it is, I wish to achieve in order to, subordinate commanders, you must do whatever you want to do in order to achieve my broad objectives. It is the opposite of top-down command, the fails tactique, that is the senior officers micromanaging subordinates. And actually, when it works, it can work fantastically well. Now, this is basically enshrined in the nearest thing the British had to doctrine in 1915, that is field service regulations, of course, originally commissioned and at least to some extent influenced, maybe partly written, by Douglas Hay. So actually the theory is good. The problem is that not everybody has bought into this system going down the command chain. It is very hierarchical, a very hierarchical system, and individuals are afraid to take the initiative, and they're much happier, frankly, being micromanaged. So actually we have the right idea, but distinct problems in its execution. And at least 3 examples I think we can see on the 25th of April which bring this home. Hamilton and Hunter Weston at Helles, of course. Hunter Weston gets sucked into, obsessed by the fighting at W Beach, and of course does not step back and actually act as the overall divisional commander, for example, to reinforce the landings at X and Y beaches where there's next to no opposition. And Hamilton, of course, has a very, very hands-off approach, and he fails to intervene when he saw, or as he should have seen, his subordinate Hunter Weston getting it wrong. And so the whole thing was mission command, but mission command going disastrously wrong, and the seniors failing to intervene to put things right. Y Beach, of course, is the ridiculous situation in which there was no overall task force commander appointed. 2 battalions were landed at Y Beach, 2 lieutenant colonels. Neither one was in command of the other. Basically, no one was prepared to seize the initiative. The result being that although one of the lieutenant colonels actually carried out a recce as far as Krithia, they did not move smartly off the beach, up the cliff and off the beach, to come into the rear of the Turkish defences at Helles, which actually could have turned the tide on the day. And once again, an example, I think, of, in this case, middle-ranking officers, battalion commanders, simply failing to get it, to get what the doctrine was all about. And finally, Birdwood at ANZAC. He, of course, almost personified the personal leadership approach. He was allegedly incredibly popular among the Australians and New Zealanders. I'm not entirely sure how true that was, but certainly he was very much a sort of be seen at the front type of officer. And it's pretty clear to me that certainly on the evening of 25th of April, he lost his nerve and wanted to evacuate ANZAC, but actually refused to take the order and kicked it upstairs to Hamilton. When I was there with my military party in July, we discussed this in a sort of seminar on ANZAC Beach, and they decided actually it was not, as Birdwood said, that his troops had lost their nerve, it was Birdwood himself. Well, what caused deadlock during the First World War at Gallipoli and on the Western Front? Well, very, very briefly, force to space ratio. What I mean by that is, particularly on the Western Front, and also, of course, at Gallipoli, there are a large number of troops crammed into a very small area, which makes it not only impossible to turn a flank, every attack has to be made frontally. Obviously, there is a difference with the maritime flank at Gallipoli, coming on to that later. There's the high technology and low technology problem. High technology, modern quick-firing artillery and machine guns. Low technology, the Mark I spade, which we can dig a trench, and the barbed wire, which you can put up in front of it. The fact there's a lack of a usable instrument of exploitation. Now, cavalry is not completely obsolete. There are good examples of it being used in the First World War, but it's no longer as useful as it had been 100 years before. And of course, the tank as an instrument of exploitation is a world war away, and of course it doesn't even exist at the time of Gallipoli. And logistics, it proved to be hugely difficult, not impossible, until the very last year of the war to keep even putative breakthroughs in supply, and something which was particularly difficult for the British on the Western Front and Gallipoli, a chronic lack of heavy guns, again until late in the war. Specifically, there were particular problems at Gallipoli. This lack of strategic depth, there was quite simply little space for multi-divisional operations, something again which struck me like a blow between the eyes standing up in Akibaba this year, when you can see the entire Helles front lined up between you. Even if you put all the assets at Helles in at one go, there's not much elbow room. There is also, of course, huge problems relating to communications and command organisation in conducting multi-front operations. The August offensive, for example, trying to combine Suvla, ANZAC and Helles, proved to be incredibly difficult. And of course, in the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, there were second 11 commanders and second 11 troops. Sir James Edmonds, who of course served on the Western Front of the First World War, was a British official historian of the war, said something to the effect that I'm not surprised that Johnny Hamilton could not win at Gallipoli given the standard of his subordinates. To which I would actually add, as attractive a personality and as a liberal a personality Hamilton was, I would include him as part of the problem as well. The troops. One of my little bits of research was come out from Dardanelles White. Just before they landed at Gallipoli, White said to Bean, the Australian war correspondent, he thought it was a great honour to be sent to Gallipoli to serve alongside the regular troops of the 29th Division. They would not send us unless they thought we were competent. Well, assuming White's views were reported accurately, he was being naive. The ANZACs were sent to the Dardanelles because they happened to be available in Egypt, and the Ottomans were not supposed to pose much of a threat. So raw, untried, poorly trained and poorly disciplined third-class troops, as they were regarded, I think, at this time, could be sent without too many risks being taken. And of course the comments about the 29th Division are also inaccurate. It largely consisted of regular battalions, but it was not a regular division. It had never trained together properly, it didn't have a formed staff before the war, and crucially, like every other British Empire, but not French formation, it was critically understocked with artillery and with shells. In other words, like the ANZACs and the Royal Naval Division and the Territorial and New Army forces that were sent later on, the 29th was a scratch formation, not up to Western Front standards, but good enough, it was thought, to deal with an inferior colonial opponent like the Turk. And if insufficient artillery and shells factor is something which comes through all the documents of the period. Of course, famously, I think it was in May 1915, Hamilton requests more shells from home. Didn't help, this request came in just after the shell scab had broken on the Western Front, to receive the incredibly unhelpful reply from the War Office along the lines of, well, your supply of shells will never calculate on the basis of a prolonged campaign, therefore you must crack on quickly to end the campaign, because they can't end the campaign without having the shells. A perfect circular argument. We should also not underestimate the opponents. There were good, in fact, in some cases excellent, Ottoman and German commanders. Lehman von Sanders and Mustafa Kemal, pictures up there. And many, in fact, came as a surprise to me, quite how many Turkish officers are actually German trained and German influenced. They're actually working with a common doctrine, which actually in 1915 is certainly superior to British doctrine. Not least actually they pay some attention to it. And of course the Turkish soldiers themselves, Ottoman soldiers I should say really, were tough and resilient. They made very good use of terrain. Now, in the attack, frankly they're not that good. They get slaughtered in droves as they attack, for example, in the night attack at ANZAC in May, but actually put them on a good piece of terrain, give them modern weapons, rifles, even occasionally machine guns, and they're extremely difficult to dislodge. So the Turks being a pushover is frankly a fantasy born of, well, partly underestimation of the Turkish ability based on their poor performance in the Balkan Wars, also I think on a healthy dose of racial superiority and cultural superiority, half of the Brits. Now you might argue that there is at least one advantage, at least potentially, to breaking the deadlock at Gallipoli compared to the Western Front. That is carrying out an amphibious hook. It is possibly surprising that actually after the failure of the initial landings in April, they don't simply put more troops on ships and take them round the flank, much as in the way as the Americans in the Sicily campaign in 1943 used some very short-range hooks to get round the German defences. Well, I think the reason for that, well, numerous reasons, but one I think is that the Royal Navy, not unreasonably, felt its fingers had been rather burnt as a result of what was going on here, not least because of the fear of what might happen to their battleships. Of course, Queen Elizabeth is the only modern ship, British ship present in the Gallipoli campaign, because operating inland, especially at a time when U-boats start to appear. Now, lessons are learned from Gallipoli. There are some serious plans on the Western Front for some amphibious operations. Haig and GHQ are talking to his naval colleagues about this in 1916, and particularly in 1917, they go as far as actually putting an entire division, the 1st Division, to a so-called hush camp. There's a cover story that they're suffering from one horrible disease or other, and basically they're then trained to carry out amphibious operations. The idea being that if the army does succeed in breaking out of the salient in the 3rd Battle Week, the Passchendaele offensive, that will then trigger a landing behind enemy lines, complete actually with tanks being landed onto the beach. And it's pretty clear to me, having had a look at some of the plans, they are making very conscious efforts to learn from the experience of Gallipoli. But the bottom bullet point, I think, continues to be really important. That the Royal Navy had a completely understandable fear of operating too close to land. And so, in the end, I think that the fact that the breakout does not happen from the Ypres salient is regretted, well, I think, something with a sigh of relief by the Royal Navy. And so this operation does not happen. One actually does happen basically a year later, in October 1918, where the Germans have finally pulled back from the Belgian coast. There, the Royal Navy actually delivers troops onto the Belgian coast. Command problems. Okay, well, of course, I'm far from the first person who looked at command problems at Gallipoli. Tim Travers, some 20-odd years ago, looked at this, and I don't agree with all of his conclusions, but he certainly comes up with some very interesting points. Here's a quote from the official eyewitness in the Mesopotamia Campaign, Edmund Candler. "The good old days the German advanced with his troops and indicated the point of attack with a wave of his hand are no more. His business is with maps and wires. He is the brain, not the pulse of the machine." Well, actually, this is a rather simplistic quote, because, of course, the idea of someone sort of riding ahead and waving a cocked hat was long in the past, even by 1915, 1916. And British commanders certainly were not all wedded to that by that point. But I think actually it does make a very interesting point about this is an army in which command is in transition. Certainly, I don't think you'll find commanders of the status of Hamilton at Gallipoli or Haig on the Western Front yearning for the days of riding ahead and waving with a cocked hat. But nonetheless, there is a still element of personalised command, and if not a reluctance to grapple with a new form of managerial command, there is some difficulty in coping with the changes that involves. And the historian Andrew Syke, that's how he pronounces his name, has come up with some very interesting insights into command specifically in the eastern theatres against the Ottomans, largely, I must say, in Mesopotamia and Palestine. And he points out that alongside the defects of individual commanders, which I'll come on into a moment, that in 1915, 1916, there is a lack of attention to logistics and the analysis of intelligence, which has a distinct bearing on command failures against the Ottomans. He suggests that there is a continued emphasis on inspirational leadership. Now, I actually, in my writings and my lectures, draw a distinction between command and leadership. They are related, but they are not the same. But actually, to act as a leader is the default setting for a commander. It is relatively easy, as Haig did, for example, at First Ypres, to ride forward to see what he can do on the front line. Actually, hanging back and trying to sort out a managerial sort of way command is more difficult and more demanding. A bit unfair to pick on Haig for that, because he actually turns out to be, in my view, extremely effective as a managerial commander. And then you have the problems generated by trench warfare, which, as Sykes suggests, undermine processes and exacerbated material shortages. So what we're talking about here is not individual blunders, not just individual blunders by commanders, although Lord knows they're there. It's actually also about the problems in a wider context of an army whose command system and command processes are in transition. They're moving from one form of warfare towards a rather more complex one. Now here I am probably sounding a bit like Tim Travers. I certainly don't go the whole way down his line of sort of personalised army and impossible to change. I certainly argue that the process of change in the British Army long predates the First World War. Haig is not the only thinking soldier in the British Army thinking about sort of things around the First World War. But clearly it is an army that is undergoing a form of transition. And quite frankly, the Western Front and the other campaigns against the Ottomans are fairly brutal auditions. Some people who are senior in 1914 last the course through to the end of the war. Others fall down by the wayside, and a pretty effective meritocracy, rough meritocracy, emerges during the First World War, meaning that people are propelled to the top, having shown their mettle further down. It's notable, I think, I'm sure Pete will correct me if I'm wrong about this, but of the 5 army commanders under Haig's command in 1918, only 2 have been army commanders on the Somme. All the others have been corps commanders, which I think is something worth thinking about. Individual culpability. Well, Stopford, it's the only picture I could find of him, his Chief of Staff, Reid, and Hamilton at Suvla. It's a bit like shooting fish in a barrel. There are so many mistakes that occur in the August offensive, it's almost superfluous to say too much about them. All I would say about it is that I think that Stopford, I do have some sympathy for. I think he knew he was simply not up to the job. Steve Badsey has suggested that it wasn't simply a matter of seniority that got him into place. It's also he was unwittingly wrapped up in the political struggles between French on the Western Front and Kitchener, and basically he was the man who was appointed as a result. But fatally, Hamilton allowed his plan for Suvla to be watered down without actually gripping it, sacking Stopford, which of course he did do later, or indeed insisting that his plan is followed. It's the worst sort of compromise command. And of course you find similar problems at roughly the same time as the Battle of Loos. French and Haig have fundamentally different concepts on how to fight the battle, and I personally think that French is actually in the wrong about his plan. But I think what is interesting is that French does not attempt to impose his view of how the battle is conducted on his subordinate Haig. Rather, the two exist side by side with disastrous impact. Yet this is not, of course, the end of the story. One of the problems with Gallipoli, it is actually at the beginning of the learning curve, learning process, it's better called, for the British Army in the First World War. A meritocracy does emerge in the course of the war. And this actually is allied to the growth of the experience. Of course, Walter Braithwaite, not a particularly efficient Chief of Staff to Hamilton in 1915. Pretty good corps commander in 1918. It's his corps that breaks the Hindenburg line on on the 29th of September. Combination of experience and quite possibly he was the wrong man to have in a staff job, senior staff job in 1915. The learning curve includes learning in logistics and intelligence. It isn't simply about tactics. And in some extent, what we're talking about here is relearning old lessons or indeed applying common sense. In any case, it actually works. There's also what I've called the art of the possible in trench warfare command. Increasingly, technology comes to play a role, whether it be the RFC flying contact patrols, or of course by 1918, it's possible to put primitive wireless sets in armoured cars and actually send them forward. We certainly haven't reached the stage you reach in 3945 for as communications, but by 1918, technologically, communication systems are well advanced they had been 3 or 4 years earlier. And of course, mission command actually is devolved pretty well down the command chain, and actually it becomes to be recognised, used and internalised by junior commanders. So, by 1918 it is possible to give broad objectives and expect subordinates actually to work out their own salvation within the commander's intent. And the final point I put on here is simply what I describe as the permissive environment of the Western Front. That is, quite simply, it's a much easier place to fight a war than Gallipoli is. Just look at the terrain. Logistics. Well, of course, the poor infrastructure at Gallipoli is the reason why the Suvla Bay Operations Campaign is planned in the first place. The terrain at Gallipoli is absolutely unforgiving. So, for example, they're largely reliant on horse and mule transport. In effect, there is no chance of using motor transport at Gallipoli. There's no closer first-class port than Alexandria, and of course the U-boat threat in the Mediterranean produces things like the sinking of HMS Triumph. Compare that with the Western Front, a campaign being conducted in modern, advanced Western European countries with commensurate infrastructure, which of course is very, very close to the UK. Trying to fight a modern war at the sort of distances that Gallipoli is, A from Alexandria and B from the UK, is simply piling up difficulty upon difficulty, which is not there for the Western Front. Rhys Crawley's excellent work, Climax at Gallipoli, which I encourage you all to read, basically shows how the August Offensive was never going to work on logistic and engineering basis alone. Quite simply, it was a non-starter because they had failed to take the logistics into account. And we can, I think, compare this with Haig's ambitious plans for the Somme in 1916, which do not seem to be backed by rigorous logistic planning. Although for his later campaigns, they certainly are. And finally, one of the key reasons why 1918 is so much more successful is that advances are made to be relatively shallow and, above all, logistically sustainable. In my view, it's the revolution, wrong word, but the transformation in the effectiveness of transportation between Passchendaele in 1917 and the 100 Days in 1918 makes the style of fighting, which in the end wins the war on the Western Front, it makes it possible. Very briefly, the medical challenges. Well, I'm not going to go into very great detail about this, except to say the figures I've dug out is that if you're at Gallipoli, you were roughly, on average, twice as likely to fall sick as you were on the Western Front. And this sickness problem is exacerbated by Hamilton's lackadaisical approach to the medical side in Gallipoli, compared not only to Haig's, but also to Sir John French's. And again, if you want to read about this, Mark Harrison's book, The Medical War, is excellent on this. And of course, at Gallipoli, unlike on the Western Front, you are continually under fire. There is nowhere on the peninsula that is safe from fire. And I think it's in the shell shock report of 1922. Witnesses reported as everybody, whether they had been diagnosed as suffering from, didn't use this term, but psychiatric casualties, being psychiatric casualty or not, actually in effect was when they left the peninsula in December and January 1916. And yet, in some ways, on Gallipoli, they were groping towards at least some of the elements of successful operations which come right on the Western Front in 1718. Famously, of course, Plumer, the commander of the Second Army, carries out a series of highly effective, limited bite-and-hold operations. You attack on a narrow front, massed artillery in support, grab a section of line, bite it in other words, hold on to that bite and then hold it against enemy counterattacks, bring up the guns and all over again. Well, of course, famously, Hamilton is groping towards this as early as the summer of 1915. The old battle tactics have clean vanished. I've only quite realised new conditions. The only thing is by cunning or surprise or skill or tremendous expenditure of high explosive, it's largely the latter actually, or great expenditure of good troops, ditto, to win some small tactical position which the enemy may be bound, perhaps for military or perhaps political reasons, to attack. Then you can begin to kill them pretty fast. A crude way of putting it, but that's actually the essence of bite and hold. And so, for example, at the Third Battle of Krithia, 4th, 6th of June, 500-yard advance, Turks take 9,000 casualties, Allies 6,500 casualties. Pretty clear that the Turks are suffering and really very worried about what's going on. But at Gallipoli, a place where casualties are simply not being replaced at anything like the required rate. In fact, for some weeks after initial landings, no reinforcements are arriving at all. They cannot afford this level of casualties. It is a strategic dead end as far as the Gallipoli campaign is concerned. So, right idea, wrong circumstances, wrong timings. In recent years, some people have been putting forward the idea of really pure attrition as being the way forward. And certainly Foch has received a lot of praise for his methods. So, for example, the attack at Boucheven on the Somme in August 1916. Well, Haig has actually had a fair amount of stuff coming the other way. Because he never lost sight of the necessity to plan for a breakthrough or even to widen and expand break-ins, if you get the difference. Breaking into the enemy position as opposed to breaking through. His operational concept, which I must say I've worked on, not least building on the work of people like my colleague Steve Badsey, is that he never ceased to believe, I think he was right to do so, that actually there was always the opportunity to take advantage of local fleeting windows of opportunity, and therefore using mobile troops, cavalry, cyclists, whatever had to hand, actually was pretty effective. Well, even on Gallipoli, there were, I think, opportunities for at least limited advances. The first three battles of Krithia, actually the Turks were very worried at various points that actually the line would simply give way. I don't think there was ever going to be opportunity to storm across the peninsula and chuck the Turks out, but some quite substantial advances, I think, were on the cards if only reserves had been possible. And in fact, in the post-war Kirk report on the lessons of the Great War, they actually, I think, rather ambitiously say if tanks had been available in 1915 at Gallipoli, then some advances would have been possible. I think the train would have actually ruled that out, but nonetheless, I think for tanks with mobile troops, maybe there's some truth in that. In 1918, finally, circumstances favour Haig's, sorry, I'm going to military speak again, concept of operations, CONOPS. And at last, I think what we can see in 1918 is bite and hold on a large scale, switching the point of attack up and down the line thanks to the improved logistic infrastructure. All of this was relentless pressure, attrition on the German line, which pushed them back from position to position, which ended up with them throwing in the towel in November. Again, circumstances simply did not permit that or anything like it at Gallipoli. So, some concluding thoughts. At Gallipoli, the absolutely appalling terrain and environment, the colonial war mentality, which meant that the second or even the third 11 in commanders and troops were what was sent, and the fact that they were at the very beginning of the British Army's learning process. All of this meant that the men who were sent had a very rough time, and even with the best troops and best commanders, I think they would have struggled to do very much better than they actually did. On the Western Front, clearly there is a very bad start, to put it mildly. But a host of factors then allow improvement leading to effectiveness at all levels in 1918. This, ladies and gentlemen, I suggest, would have been absolutely impossible to achieve at Gallipoli, even if the campaign had lasted to 1918. The men of Gallipoli, I think, were sent on an impossible task. We should simply marvel they achieved as much as they did under such appalling circumstances. Thank you very much indeed.
I want to find the pirate, I know where he is. I know where he is. I know where he is. If you want to find the private, I know where he is.